Hello, welcome. I'm Tom Clays, the president of the board of the, the Santa Monica Conservancy. Thank you for joining us for this final lecture of the Mosaic second season. Through educational programs and advocacy, the Santa Monica Conservancy has fulfilled its mission of promoting and celebrating our architectural and cultural history here in Santa Monica for nearly 2 decades. With support from people like you, we've become the leading voice in our community for embracing historic preservation and adaptive reuse while celebrating our diverse historic heritage. We want to thank our sponsors tonight, Boston Properties and Pankow Builders. Boston Properties is the largest publicly held developer and owner of Class A office properties in the US. They have a major presence here in Santa Monica, where they own Colorado Center and Santa Monica Business Park. Pankow is a pioneer of design, build, and integrated project delivery, providing general contracting for commercial, educational, healthcare, residential, and tenant improvement services throughout California. If you're already a supporter of the Conservancy, we want to thank you. If you have not yet contributed, you can use the links in the chat function at the bottom of your screen to either donate or become a member. Now I want to introduce Libby Motika to begin our program. Libby?
We in the Conservancy have spent the last year focusing on the communities whose history and culture have contributed key pieces to the mosaic we call Santa Monica. Today's lecture offers another view of the Pico neighborhood with an emphasis on the Mexcican community. That is the oldest settlement in the area, roughly bound by Pico on the south, Santa Monica Boulevard on the north, Centinela on the east, and Lincoln Boulevard on the west. Our speaker, Jaime Cruz, will recall for us the vitality of the neighborhood, which in the 1940s was de facto integrated with African Americans and Latino families living side by side with whites and Asian Americans. He will take us through the developments in succeeding decades that displaced much of the working class and people of color. And he will characterize the neighborhood as it is today. Cruz brings a personal as well as academic approach to the subject. He lives in the Pico neighborhood, was born in the Pico neighborhood, and as an associate professor at Santa Monica College, he specializes in the political, social, cultural, and economic changes in American society. Before I introduce Jaime, I'd like to remind all of you that you have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the lecture. And so now, with no further ado, I welcome Jaime Cruz. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for taking the time to be here, sharing space with me, and allowing me to present a brief history of the Mexican people here in Santa Monica. I'd like to thank the Santa Monica Conservancy for allowing me to use this platform to share what I know with you all, given that I don't have that much tenure living in this community. I'm nearing half a century. So I was born and raised in here in what is now called the Pico neighborhood of Santa Monica. And, I often tell, my students I was born, raised, and I'll die here one day. I think, eventually, eventually all of us will cross that path. So in short, the Mexican people in Santa Monica goes back a very long time. Now, we're nearing the 200-year mark, or anniversary rather, when Mexico gained its independence from Spain. This September will be the 200th anniversary, 1821 on September 16th. The Mexican people in Santa Monica and much of the Southwest has had a strong presence. Before I begin this presentation, I'd like to first acknowledge the indigenous people that have dominated much of what we now consider the county of Los Angeles, the TONGVA. I, along with the Santa Monica Conservancy, acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino TONGVA people. Pico Boulevard and what is now called the Pico Neighborhood centers around the last Mexican governor of California, Don Pio Pico. He assumed the governorship up until 1846, up until the infancy stages of the American-Mexican War. Pio Pico was indigenous, and he was also of Africana descent. Someone that we oftentimes, or oftentimes is overlooked or falls under the radar is whom I call the co-founder of Santa Monica, Arcadia Bandini Estudio. You see, Arcadia was married to Colonel Robert Baker in 1874. And Baker, along with Senator Jones, are attributed with founding the city of Santa Monica. Yet Arcadia was married to Colonel Baker. You know, she was a very prominent Mexican figure, very wealthy. She came from a wealthy family. Her family was from San Diego. And, you know, in the latter part of the 19th century, she was considered one of the richest women in the United States. Yet, you know, when she passes, you know, she leaves no will, doesn't have any children. And, you know, by 1912 and thereafter, a lot of her assets go, you know, are up for probate. However, La Madrina, or the Mexican godmother of Santa Monica, I'd prefer respectfully to consider her the co-founder of Santa Monica. It's in the early 1910s that we begin to see a wave of Mexicans immigrating to the US, specifically to Los Angeles and Santa Monica. The earliest Mexican people that settled in Santa Monica came from the state of Jalisco. It's about 1,300 miles. And in fact, I've also come across records indicating that there were some Oaxacans here in Santa Monica as well. The state of Oaxaca is further south. It's an indigenous community. And that's a community, in fact, where my people are from. So in short, you know, since we're focusing on the Mexican people in the early 20th century up until the early 21st century, it's important to note that the Mexican presence was around during this time. And additionally, something that is also of significance to note that the majority, or let me rephrase that, a large faction of the Mexican population that immigrated in the early 1910s came from affluent backgrounds. So contrary to this idea that, you know, they came poor, which many did, and you know, there was a strong presence of affluent Mexican people that came to Santa Monica and other parts of the Southwest. Among the work that the non-affluent Mexicans did was they contributed to the building of the Pacific Electric Railway in the early 1910s. In fact, there's a lot of scholarship out there, scholarship that is not necessarily read in secondary schools. Generally, you have to, respectfully be in a privileged position, i.e. go to college in order to be exposed to that scholarship, assuming that, you enroll in a class that discusses the contributions of Mexican people. And in short, the one thing to also note that there was a group of Mexican people from Venice and Santa Monica that played a very instrumental role in advocating for a permanent monument of los Traqueros, the Mexican railroad workers, to be installed in Venice. And that is set to come into fruition soon. In short, one of the things to also keep in mind is that these people, many came to work, and while they were here, they also experienced a lot of discrimination, and what I call the employment glass ceiling. What is meant by that is, in terms of moving up the employment class ladder, that was something that didn't pertain, to the Mexican people, among other people of color. Now, the 1910s was also, and the early 1920s was an era of immigration restrictions. The people that were considered, or the immigrants rather, that were considered the new immigrants, that is, those immigrants that were coming from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Poland. You had Russian Jews, you had Italians. They were considered ethnic whites. Large fraction of them, came illiterate, they came poor, and they came with very little skill. I mean, respectfully, does that, remind you of something in terms of immigrants that, or a percentage of them that are attempting to acquire their international right to come to the United States? Well, all that to say is that in 1917, for example, a literacy exam is put in place in order to weed out the illiterate. Of course, to some degree, being educated would equate to having economic capital. Leapfrog to 1924, where the number of immigrants that were allowed to come to the U.S. Was brought down to 2%. And keep in mind that those that were immigrating from Europe. They were specifically immigrating from Eastern Europe. Additionally, it should also be noted that the Asian population were banned. Yet the need for labor, or laborers rather, was something that has been rather consistent. And the Mexican people in the 1920s continued to come despite the xenophobic and nativist attitude that was rendered upon them. This is more of a current map. Of course, keep in mind that there were no neighborhood groups in the 1920s or zip codes. But I do want to kind of give you an idea of where the Mexican population, among other people, were centered around. So in what is now dubbed the Pico Neighborhood, which consists of the boundaries of Santa Monica Boulevard to the north, Centinela to the east, Pico Boulevard to the south, and Lincoln Boulevard to the west. There was also another enclave here off of Pico Boulevard and 4th Street. It was known as Belmar Place. That was also a Mexican hub, a Mexican community, among other people that live there. But it's important to note that Mexican people were there too. And additionally, contrary to this idea that, the Mexican people are not or have not been intimately connected to education, that is not true. In fact, without going into a discussion about this, there is a court case, the first court case that allowed the integration of Mexican kids into a public school. This took place in Texas in 1925. It is called well, you're gonna have to ask me during comments. So in short, the barrio, or the neighborhood where the Mexican people lived, was centered on 17th Street. 17th Street is the epicenter of Santa Monica, by the way. So 17 blocks west, you get to Ocean Avenue, which is the border. 17 blocks to the east, you get to Centinela. And in short, these homes, Mexican homes, Mexican-owned family homes, right? Was something that was also very prominent. To your left is a home on 1828 17th Street between Delaware and Michigan. This is where the Alonso family settled, and the Alonso family, in fact, is still around today. In fact, these images were shared with me by Danny, a prominent artist here in Santa Monica. I grew up across the street from that home, and I did catch the sort of the tail end of these eras. Now what you have in place are apartment buildings. Now, going back to the statement related to Mexicans being intimately connected to their education, the latter part of the 19th, early to mid part of the 20th century consisted of schools for Mexicans that were called Mexican schools. And a Mexican school that I characterized in Santa Monica was St. Anne's School. There's also a church. It's a Catholic church. And despite the discrimination and hostile environments that many people of color experienced, including Mexicans, Mexican families sent their children to St. Anne's, a private school, a Catholic school. All of the teachers for the generations to come were nuns. And I caught the tail end of that experience. I did attend St. Anne's School for several years, and there are no more nuns and no more convent. But yet, one thing that I do, one thing that I can relate to is the connection to poverty. The students that were attending St. Anne's were all required to wear a uniform. And so you couldn't tell the difference between or whether or not somebody was had economic means or came from economic means, because everybody dressed the same. Yet the instruction at this school was a lot more rigorous than at the public schools. Much of the tuition that parents needed to pay was oftentimes offset by their volunteer work. So all this to say that St. Anne's not only was an educational hub, but it was also a place of worship for the Mexican community. Yet the demographics on Sundays, have changed quite drastically. The cohort in 1947, the cohort in 1960, predominantly consisted of Mexican students. And again, I caught the tail end of things, but I still experienced them. This priest at the center of this picture to the right is Monsignor Wood. Monsignor Wood was pastor of St. Anne's for many generations. He ended up passing in 1920s, early 1930s. The US experiences a global pandemic, and what's called a depression. And generally, whenever there is economic distress, there are scapegoats, and I think it's important to recognize that the historical economic disruptions and the more current economic disruptions have resulted in certain groups being blamed for taking away jobs or reaping the benefits of subsidized healthcare or education. But in short, between 1929 and 1936, there was a program known as the Mexican Repatriation Program. And basically what this consisted of was to encourage, in many cases, force the Mexican and Mexican American community to return or move to Mexico. See, and it's estimated that 60% of the 1.8 million Mexicans that were sent to or deported to Mexico were legal residents. I mean, there was forms of racial profiling that would ensue during this time period. Now, what you're seeing here is a letter from the Department of Labor. This was sent to the Jesus Alonso and his wife in September 1937. So the Alonsos were here lawfully, yet they were essentially told to self-deport, right? And again, given that they were legally here, but it's also just as a footnote for you, it should also be noted that there were thousands, over 75,000 Mexican who were American, going back to the year 1848. Article 8 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that essentially ended the American-Mexican War allowed those Mexicans that chose to remain in the U.S. to become American citizens. Now, in short, just to point out just some of the signs and reminders of where Mexicans stood. These are among some. In regards to sanctioned segregation, one thing to factor in was racial restrictive covenants that were in place for some time after 1926. And restrictive covenants essentially consisted of homeowners agreeing to put language in their property titles to not allow people of color to purchase or lease or rent property. in areas that were concentrated by members of the dominant group. Another form of housing segregation consisted of redlining, something that spearheaded under the Franklin Roosevelt administration in 1933. Now, in short, in Santa Monica, for example, let's just focus here on the red coloration, which consisted of the federal government identifying areas that were considered hazardous. Well, it suggested that areas that were considered hazardous equated to areas where people of color lived, which included African Americans and Mexican Americans. Yet, the areas, the area in white were areas that were not yet developed. But all this to say is that this area here, the coloration at the center of Santa Monica, is where what would become the Pico Neighborhood. Now, another important fact to point out is that one of our very own Santa Monicans, Jose Gandara, served in World War II. He was killed in 1944. Yet, despite the fact that over 500,000 Mexicans fought on behalf of the U.S., an estimated 17 Mexicans coming back were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. They did not benefit from the GI Bill. The GI Bill was a form of government assistance. Among other things, returning GIs were allowed to acquire home loans at very low interest rates. And additionally, they were able to, put 5% down of what the property was worth instead of the traditional 20%. But see, just briefly, when you think about generational wealth, that was something that the Mexican community, among other groups, didn't benefit from. And so it's also important to recognize the residual effects of these forms of government assistance. Oftentimes we think of government assistance as welfare and so forth. Now, furthermore, the Mexican enclave that's known as or was known as Belmar Place, centered around Pico Boulevard, 4th Street to Ocean, and via eminent domain, that community was lost. Among other groups that lived there were African Americans. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, the federal government began to spearhead urban renewal programs. And basically what urban renewal was a program that the federal government essentially would give cities millions of dollars to identify areas that were considered slums. And it suggested that urban renewal programs was a code word for the removal of people of color in certain communities. For instance, in the early 1950s, the area of Chavez Ravine, where the Los Angeles Dodgers currently play, consisted of 300 families that were eminent domain, that were promised housing, but it never came into fruition. Folks that were forcibly removed by the LA County sheriffs, and immediately thereafter their homes bulldozed, which is to some degree remnants of what members of the Belmar community also experienced. Now, there are many homes that are still, that were once owned by Mexicans in what is now the Pico neighborhood. The homes at the very top is what they looked like, and the at the bottom is what essentially replaced them. Condos, condominiums, and McMansions, or even proposals. And real estate in Santa Monica has just skyrocketed. You cannot find a property in Santa Monica under $1 million. And properties, for instance, at the corner of 20th and Delaware, this one was about a year and a half ago, was fetching not too much, about 2.4 million. Now, there are families, however, that still own their property. And I can trace a particular family that has owned their property since 1930. Many of these other families, have been in the heart of the neighborhood since the late 50s, early 1960s. And it's important to just remind ourselves what could have happened had the Interstate 10 freeway not been built and essentially carved through the heart of the Santa Monica Barrio or community. Essentially, the 10 freeway, when it was completed in 1966, resulted in an estimated 1,000 families being displaced, many to never return. And in short, just to kind of give you an idea of what the freeway did, this is an aerial view of the heart of what is now the Pico neighborhood. So this would be 17th Street. This would be the cemetery. This would be Cloverfield to the east and Pico. And this would be, the freeway, right? Now you can just imagine, the freeway, which stretches from the beach all the way to downtown Los Angeles. Keep in mind that historically, when the first freeways were built, and some would argue still, are built on the backs of communities of color. Now, the area of what is now the Pico neighborhood has also shouldered a lot of, unwanted developments, temporary landfills, recycling centers, the light rail maintenance yard, among other things. And what has always been argued by neighborhood residents is, why don't the other neighborhoods also share some of the, the brunt of these unwanted developments, including affordable housing. In short, this is north, this is south, east, and west. This would be what would be rendered the Pico neighborhood. It's an older map, but still relevant. The majority of affordable housing is concentrated in the Pico neighborhood. North of Montana, there are R1 tracts. Respectfully, they're very, they oppose any form of affordable housing being located in their respective community. This is just layout of the respective tracts in the city. Now, Mexican pastimes, in the mid 20th century included, hanging out at the Santa Monica Outdoor Mall, which was completed in 1965. It's now the 3rd Street Promenade. By the late 1970s, early 1980s, at the Cinemark Theater, the bottom right-hand image is a sign that says Cine, which is Spanish, English for movies. So that theater, in fact, hosted or played Mexican movies up until 1987. Right at the time, or 1987 is when that outdoor mall went through major renovations, and by 1989 became the 3rd Street Promenade. Social groups, consisting of fundraisers, various dance halls that the Mexican community would embark in. It would also include hanging out at the beach. And this, and I think this is also a very important note to underscore the Mexican entrepreneurships that stretch, or they go back to the early part of the 20th century. Prominent individuals, Gilberto Peña Perales, who was owner of a gas station, for example, on Ocean Avenue in Colorado, right across the street from the Santa Monica Pier. He also owned another gas station on 20th and Pico. You also had, folks that, again, were entrepreneurs, were medicine men, medicine women. They were street vendors. They sold produce in mobile trucks, right, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, it's important to it's important to recognize the fact that, the Mexican community has also been very business oriented, right? Despite, the discriminatory practices that were in place back then. Mr. Perales also opened up a restaurant on 14th and Santa Monica Boulevard called La Cazuelas. Gallegos on 6th, well, it's not there anymore. Well, both of these, businesses aren't there anymore. Gallegos was, prominent establishment where, they made tortillas. And, at one time, the Lobster, which is right adjacent to the Santa Monica Pier, was owned by a Mexican. His name is Mateo Castillo, who started off as a dishwasher in the 50s and essentially acquired this establishment and sold it into the 80s. You see remnants of Mexican imprints and murals, although dolphins are not Mexicans, but the artist, Danny Alonso, is the one that was commissioned to paint these whales and dolphins and other sea animals on Ocean Park Avenue between, I think it's 4th Street and West and the other cross street. I don't recall, but it's heading towards Lincoln Boulevard. Other forms of Mexican celebratory traditions consisted of Cinco de Mayo parades, Mexican independent parades, Dia de los Muertos. And I think it's important to recognize the organizational entity that the Mexican community had in Santa Monica. All that is has now, been filtered in, this concept of multiculturalism, right? You have all these different festivities all being embarked into one. And in short, the Mexican community has also been very much politically active. For instance, the Chicano moratorium that occurred on August 29, 1970, consisted of members of the Santa Monica community participating in this anti-Vietnam War demonstration. An estimated 30,000 people showed up. Of course, there was police violence that ensued that resulted in the murder of LA Times journalist Ruben Salazar. Grassroots organizations, very few. This is an example of one, the Latino Resource Organization, still around today. And, it was important to have these advocacy groups. Where was one to go if they needed assistance in terms of, issues related to, their landlords, or needed assistance finding, acquiring food, for instance, right? Now, there are, however, many positive stories of people that have quote unquote made it. Someone that I highly regard, of course, is my sister. She's a social worker. Another sister, not by blood but by name, is Ruth Fragoso, and she's engineer, a supervisor for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She hasn't been working there that long. She has about 30 years there. However, one thing that I want you to also recognize is that, there is a large, there's a percentage of people that didn't make it. You see, when I was growing up, again, I caught the tail end of things. We didn't know that people were going off to college. And if they did, many of them didn't come back. And so what this list that I compiled are concepts that many people that grew up in distressed communities experience. And so what I did is I highlighted the ones that impacted me. And it's nearly half, more than half, I think, right? So here's the thing that it's important to recognize that the lack of resources such as clinics, mental health, positive resources, et cetera, will essentially result in other things filling that void. Without getting into a long-winded statement on this, when certain groups are outcasted or don't feel part of, they're gonna create their own groups, unfortunately. Now, in conclusion, there are still many Mexican businesses that are still around today. From Henry's Barbershop on Olympic and 14th. Hopefully he comes back. Gilbert's has been, it's been around for over 40 years, right? There are still, many, or some businesses, I should say, that are still around, right? Yet we know that the forces of gentrification have gradually, erased or has attempted to erase the Mexican imprint in this community. And we oftentimes think of Santa Monica as this paradise by the sea or Silicon Beach. But I want you to remember that residents some 30 years or nearly 40 years ago drafted certain ideas and proposals of what they wanted this neighborhood to consist of. And when cities plan, keep in mind, they plan for the next 20 years. Many things that neighborhood residents advocated for via this Pico Neighborhood Community Plan comes into fruition. But it comes into fruition when those people are no longer there. Many have died, many have ended up in prison. And, there are a few of us that, actually went to college and stayed. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the recent extended and cemented Santa Monicans that have gone to their rest, who have impacted my life in some way or another. But more importantly, I think for me, it's my tribute is to Professor Juan Gomez Quiñones, UCLA history professor who served as an advisor, for a friend, and a father figure. And it's because of people like him that I recognize and appreciate where I'm at today. And the only thing I can do is try to give back. As much as I've taken, I attempt to reciprocate that. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. Excellent, excellent. I learned a lot, and I hope others did as well. We have a few questions to ask you.
Sure.
So I will begin. I would like to wonder, this person wants to know, as a legal resident, the same as being a citizen?
No.
No.
So the short answer to that, legal resident would consist of, having a permanent residency card, for instance, right? So there is a difference between the two.
More to the point that you just made, what happened to the Pico Neighborhood Community Plan?
Well, respectfully, it comes into fruition, but it comes into fruition years later. And there were various factors that contributed to, in my opinion, as to why these ideas and these visions, come into fruition. For example, the deregulation of rent control, Costa-Hawkins Act that was passed in 1995. I mean, over time that contributed to these astronomical rent prices in the city. So, many folk that now send their children to off to college and they try to come back, they're unable to afford to rent or even live here. Right? I think I read somewhere that in order to rent an apartment, you need to earn about $102,000. But that plan, it does come into fruition, but at a time where the neighborhood residents are not respectfully going to reap the benefits of what they advocated for.
I have a question, and then we'll go back to the panel. During World War II, when the Japanese American citizens were carted off to the reclamation to the camps, is it true that there were some Mexicans who felt a affinity to the Japanese Americans and helped to maintain the businesses while they were gone?
Absolutely, and I think and that's the very important statement there. The sense of community, of course, has evolved. It's changed over time, and there are countless stories where to your point, in terms of the Mexican families caring for the homes and businesses of Japanese Americans. In fact, there's a story, long story short, of this kid that grew up with Japanese Americans. He was 17 years old. His name is Ralph Lasso, and all of a sudden his friends started disappearing. And when he inquires where'd they go, he finds out they were sent to these internment camps. So what he does is that he ends up turning himself in and gets locked up, meetups with his friends, and remains there for 2 years.
Really? And in the relocation camp? Oh.
Yep. It's Ralph Lasso, Lazo.
Wow.
And he essentially becomes student body president. I mean, that's how close the ties were, right? So yes.
Yeah. You began your presentation with a classic Impala in front of the statue of Santa Monica. Could you briefly talk about the significance of that image?
Sure. Well, that's my vehicle there. It's a 1960 Chevrolet Impala bubble top, all original, 283 engine, all original, like its owner. Beautiful, I might add, like its owner, I think. I parked it there, a while back, in front of Santa Monica. One thing that it should also be noted is, Santa Monica is a European name, comes from Spain, and recognize that contrary to this idea that Jamestown was the first European colony that was established in 1607. In fact, it wasn't. The first colony that was established was by the Spanish in 1685. So if that's the case, then the first European language would be Espanol, right? The first colony was a Spanish colony with Spain. The first language, official language, if you will, would be Spanish.
Can you speak on any impacts you have seen thus far that the pandemic has had on the presence of Mexican people in the community? For example, Mexican-owned businesses, residential.
Terrible. I think, respectfully, what we've seen with respect to this ongoing pandemic, if you will, just think about, who the frontline workers are, right? And I think, it's important to recognize that, these people consist of the Mexican, among other communities, but, we're centering our discussion around Mexicans. And in short, countless lives have been lost, and it's sad. It's somewhat disheartening to see that. But I think the more people become aware, acquainted, the more they read, of course, they'll begin to understand why at times there's frustration by the Mexican community among other groups who feel outcasted or not prioritized, if you will. These folks are the ones that put food on your table. I'm a little short story. I'm old school. I need to read the paper hard copy. My LA Times subscription comes every day. During the pandemic, no pandemic, it was there at 4 o'clock in the morning. And, and I've come across these people at that time, right? I just want to enjoy the morning, I guess. And I've met them. So, that's the unfortunate thing.
Doing their job. Yeah, every day. Somebody wants to go back to the notion of Mexicans, I guess, self-deporting. The question is, what was happening at that time that made U.S. ask Mexicans to go back? Was it a labor competition? What was it?
So during the specifically during the 1930s, there's economic disruption, right? It's known as a depression. And so, there were, respectfully, a lot of nativists that, basically would echo the sentiments that American jobs were for American people. And so there was a lot of hostility towards immigrants, specifically in the Southwest. And that those sentiments were specifically targeted towards Mexicans. But the interesting thing is that the Mexican government also played a role in this, because they also wanted these Mexicans back. The idea was that the Mexican government at the time concluded that these Mexicans that were here in the U.S. had acquired certain skills, certain knowledge. They were building much of the American Southwest, so they were hoping that they can do the same in Mexico. And so what the Mexican government did, they would pay their airfare, train fare, bus fare for Mexicans, and the land and all these incentives. But the land that for example, that they acquired was like land that you couldn't harvest in. So, I think it's also important to recognize that, the sentiments that were echoed in the 1930s can be, applicable today. But yet, one thing to also underscore is that, this is the same population that, contributed to not only the First, but also the Second World War. And there were repatriation movements that would come in the years later. For instance, Operation Wetback is an infamous one under the Eisenhower administration in 1954. And so, I think it's important to recognize, these histories, and it's also important to recognize the importance of and the inclusivity of these histories in our primary and secondary schools. And the idea is for folks to become aware of what's happened.
On that note, this is probably apropos. Can you identify businesses and institutions and places of worship that are central places of importance in the lives of Latino people in Santa Monica today?
The one, of course, that stands out is St. Anne's. Granted, you do have Mexicans that are also of other faiths, such as Jehovah Witnesses. But the one thing you have to remember is that specifically the Mexican community is predominantly Catholic, and at least the older generation was very much intimately connected to their faith, right? And I think that also plays a role in terms of it's another discussion, but in terms of the way in which the Mexican community confronted certain forms of discrimination. But that's the only one that stands out. St. Anne's. There are others certainly, but I would argue that that's a prominent one. St. Monica's not really. It's north of Santa Monica Boulevard. It's although it's Catholic, but the majority of the Mexican community patronize St. Anne's.
Okay, one last question.
Sure.
Speak to the cultural richness of Mexicans, to theater, to music, to the arts. Can you talk about some of the things that are ongoing in Santa Monica?
I can, but I have to, say that, respectfully, these events have been, appropriated. And, whereas before, there were grassroots, they were organized by, community members. And now, for instance, it's become a bit more commercialized. And, classic example would be, Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. And, that's something that has gained traction or been a lot more, presence these days. But that tradition actually goes back, 2,500 years.
Yeah.
My people have celebrated that for that long.
Yeah.
And so, here's a statement that I made earlier, an example of the lack of, Cinco de Mayo celebrations that once were held at Grant Elementary School or Will Rogers. It doesn't happen anymore. They've all been, if I remember correctly, sort of immersed together. It's called like multicultural week or day or something like that. So, and I think it's important to have discussions and dialogues about giving various groups their respective representation.
Okay.
Because it's important for them to also know who they are, who they come, where they come from.
Thanks, Jaime. I wanted to thank our program committee, including co-chairs Steve Loper and Libby Motika, for producing this and other programs. We want to again thank our sponsors, Boston Properties and Pankow Builders. Our Mosaic lecture series will soon return this fall, likely, with more programming about the diversity of Santa Monica. We'll get back to you with that timing at a later date. Please consider now how you might get involved more with the Santa Monica Conservancy by visiting our website, which is www.smconservancy.org. All Mosaic webinars can be viewed in their entirety by going to the events and tours menu on our website. And thank you again, and have a great evening. Good night.